Hello, my name is Eric Eisner. The topic of my video is the 1826 Maryland Jew Bill. I researched this law, which the Maryland legislature passed in 1826 to allow Jews to hold political office or positions of public trust, construed here to mean anything from running for election to the city council, to working as a lawyer, to serving as a juror. For my honors thesis in history, the most generous, disinterested, and philanthropic motives, religion, race, and the Maryland Jew Bill. To research the law and the debate surrounding it, I read historical research on the subject, period newspapers, and the speeches given in the Maryland legislature. I visited the Maryland State Historical Society, the Maryland State Archives, and the Library of Congress to read archival material about the Jew Bill. In 1818, Thomas Kennedy introduced a bill in the House of Delegates to allow Jews to hold office. It soon became known throughout the state and in newspapers throughout the country as the Jew Bill, and more rarely as the Test Act. The official name of the Jew Bill varied from one legislative session to the next. The law finally passed in 1826 as an act for the relief of Jews in Maryland. The Maryland Constitution mandated that amendments must pass in two consecutive sessions of the General Assembly. After the Jew Bill passed in the 1822 session, it became the defining political issue in the next election. An anti-Jew Bill coalition framed the vote as a contest not between Democrats and Federalists, but between the Christian ticket and the Jewish ticket. The opponents of the law unseated many of the pro-Jew Bill delegates and defeated the Test Act in the 1823 session. In the next two sessions, however, the Jew Bill passed and it became law in 1826. At the time, only around 150 Jews lived in Maryland. How did debate over the political rights of such a small minority become a dominant political issue? Why did Maryland legislators stake their careers on Jewish rights? And why did newspapers as far away as Hallowell, Maine, and Charleston, South Carolina breathlessly cover the legislative struggle? Maryland's history of Catholic-Protestant conflict, which left the state with a compromise that gave full political rights to all Christian denominations, but did not separate church and state or foster a political culture that valued broader religious freedoms, presaged a series of piecemeal extensions of religious rights. For example, Maryland amended its constitution in 1795 specifically to allow individually named denominations, including Quakers, who objected to swearing an oath to hold office. The Jew Bill debate also coincided with the establishment of the first Unitarian Church in Maryland, and Judaism and Unitarianism became intermingled in the minds of Orthodox Christians opposed to the changes they saw coming to the state. The extension of full political rights to Jews reflected a broader pattern that shifted the terms of political citizenship away from property-holding Christian men and towards universal white male suffrage. Early 19th century Marylanders, it should be noted, saw Jewishness as a religious category and considered Jews white. Religious discrimination never became as deeply entrenched in American society as did racism. The United States economy did not depend on the subjugation of religious minorities, which partially explains why Jews gained full political rights so many years before blacks. Maryland's Christians felt less threatened by Judaism, a monotheistic religion with a historical connection to Christianity, than other faiths with which they were less familiar. In the words of one Christian supporter of the Jew Bill, Judaism ranked next to Christianity as the second best religion. The property requirement to vote in Maryland fell in the early 1800s. The state abolished property qualifications for state elections in 1802 and for federal elections in 1810. That same year, Maryland disenfranchised the state's free blacks. These changes in Maryland illustrate national trends in which religious tests and property qualifications gradually declined and rights for free blacks simultaneously diminished. Maryland not only represented this trend, the state also contributed to a national redefinition of citizenship. Roger Taney, who supported the Jew Bill as a Maryland state senator, later authored the Dred Scott decision as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1857. Dred Scott held, against historical evidence to the contrary, that free blacks had never been considered citizens in the United States. The Jew Bill supporters likewise resolutely opposed black rights, even measuring the intensity of their views by the standards of their time, and participated in the national political conversation. Thomas Kennedy, the primary architect of the Jew Bill, defended slavery as a positive good. Solomon Edding, a prominent Baltimore Jew who held forced slaves and lobbied for the Jew Bill, remained in correspondence with influential national politicians, including Henry Clay, into the 1830s. In the early 20th century, historians lauded the law's architects as uncomplicated heroes. In 1924, E. Milton Altfeld penned the most extensive history of the Maryland Jew Bill, The Jews' Struggle for Civil and Religious Rights in Maryland. Altfeld's book represents essentially a hagiography of Kennedy and Altfeld portrays him as almost single-handedly responsible for the Jew Bill. The chapter that introduces Kennedy bears the title, Israel's Champion Appears. Kennedy was both a poet and a politician, and Altfeld writes that Kennedy's poetry reveals his tender and pure heart, his nobility and splendor of soul. While historians in the second half of the 20th century have turned a more critical eye to the Maryland Jew Bill, they have continued to treat religious discrimination and isolation from racism. Edward Eichis criticized the previous scholarship of the Maryland Jew Bill as uncritical, celebratory, and inaccurate. He noted errors in previous accounts and attacked their triumphalist tone. Eichis, though, goes too far in the other direction in his insistence that the years of effort to pass the Jew Bill did not reflect either side's preoccupation with justice, but rather a concern with selfish interest. He cast the whole contest as an urban-rural conflict for political power. Eichis disregards the deeply held convictions of men like Kennedy, who wrote poems in praise of American liberty before he immigrated to the United States and was still an adolescent in Scotland with no plans to cross the Atlantic. The historical actors who participated in the debates over the Jew Bill possessed many often contradictory motivations. Kennedy was not merely a selfish man. He was both a committed racist and a selfless advocate of Jewish rights who risked his political career for what he believed was right. Eichis did not connect the Jew Bill or any of its backers to slavery or the diminishing rights of free blacks. Dan Guzzi, in an article about Kennedy, acknowledges his active support for slavery, but he treats this as contradictory and unrelated to Kennedy's support for religious freedom. The two impulses, one loathsome and the other laudable, were not entirely unconnected, however. Historians of the Jew Bill have treated the expansion of Jewish political rights as part of a general increase in equality in Maryland, but the evidence does not support this conclusion. In 1984, the historian Morden Borden argued that the expansion of religious liberty and its political sibling was not inevitable in America, and that the Jewish presence in the country broadened religious freedom. This reflects a school of thought that holds religious liberty as the foundation of broader freedoms. Michael McConnell, a legal scholar, contends that for the United States, the idea of religious freedom is our first freedom, both in chronological and logical priority. The philosopher Jürgen Habermas writes, "The inclusion of religious minorities in the political community kindles and fosters sensitivity to the claims of other discriminated groups." In the case of the Jew Bill, though, sensitivity to anti-Jewish discrimination did not breed sensitivity to the plight of the state's free and enslaved blacks. Recently, some historians have begun to connect the conflict over religious freedom to racism in the 19th century. Jacob Katz-Kogan links the fall of property requirements to the end of the possibility of free black and women's suffrage. The 18th century grounding of political rights in property and faith gave way to the 19th century emphasis on race and sex as the basis for political inclusion shifted from exterior to interior qualities. Rosemary Zagari writes that a revolutionary backlash and increased emphasis on the ballot box in the 1830s pushed women out of the political space they had occupied in the preceding decades. Ryan P. Jordan argues that white American Protestants often understood religious liberty to be a racially and religiously exclusive freedom, contrasted with the religious slavishness of non-whites and non-Protestants. White Protestants used the rhetoric of religious liberty and separation of church and state as a tool to further white supremacy and religious prejudice in the 19th century. The interconnected language of religious liberty and racial difference justified both domestic discrimination and imperial conquest. Kogan, Zagari, and other historians, such as Donald Radcliffe, all note the biological essentialism of Jacksonian populism, which simultaneously enfranchised poor white men and disenfranchised black men who held property. The scholarship on the Maryland Jew Bill has yet to address the relationship between religious rights and discrimination against blacks. Scholarship on the history of religious freedom and racism have generally progressed on separate tracks. Although this has recently begun to change, as historians have noted the nonlinear expansion of political rights in America, the same mentality can champion both justice and injustice at the same time. The Maryland Jew Bill is best seen in this new paradigm. Jewish rights cannot be investigated in isolation from the rights of blacks. The history of Jewish rights must be brought in line with the history of Jacksonianism. Just as historians have recently shown how the end of the property requirement was connected to the political exclusion of free blacks, this disenfranchisement cannot be separated from the story of how Jews became equal before the law in America. When E. Milton Altfeld returned to civilian life after the First World War, he raised money to erect a monument in Hagerstown over the grave of Kennedy, a man who knew not Jew, yet knew the principles of humanity and brotherhood. Altfeld writes, "If our people understood the tremendous effort put forth by Kennedy and the obstacles he had to overcome, surely they would arrange an annual pilgrimage to his grave." But the Presbyterian Kennedy, anointed by Altfeld as the patron saint of humanity, brotherhood, and Maryland's Jews, also believed that slavery was not a curse to the United States, but a blessing. The debate over the Jew Bill was a moral drama, but the cast cannot be divided between high and low ground. Belief in religious freedom and brotherhood between Jews and Christians was often inseparable from ideas of a natural racial hierarchy and the rightness of slavery. In a speech in favor of the Jew Bill, H.M. Brackenridge insisted that Kennedy, the champion of the Jews, had only the most generous, disinterested, and philanthropic motives. The story of the Jew Bill, however, illustrates the country's tangled moral contradictions more than the altruistic charity of a great American pulling the nation towards Thomas Jefferson's promise of the nation founded on the self-evident truth of the equality of all in creation. Jefferson himself was unable to accept the full impact of his words, and America's path to fulfill a purpose that transcends the imperfections of its authors has been neither inevitable nor straightforward. In the early 19th century, Jews pressed ahead and African Americans fell back on the winding road to equal rights.